Right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Hey, team. As I mentioned before, my name is Will Sheeler. I am one of our Android tech leads at a company called Premise Data, and I am here to chat with you about how ChatGPT can make you a better software developer, a better Android developer in particular. Now, some of you may note that I am not, in fact, Sagar Das, and this is not, in fact, identify Android app startup time issues. In fact, you would be correct if you noted that. In fact, you might even be able to alternatively entitle my talk how to create Android startup time issues using sketchy generated code. After all, ChatGPT has been described by some as an instant legacy code generator. I had a friend who once sent me this tweet that I thought was especially insightful to the experience of ChatGPT. Here are the stages of playing with it. OMG, this can do anything. There goes my job. I should start a business. Actually, some of these responses are not too good. Some of them are just awful. This isn't really intelligence. This is more of a spicy autocomplete. I always thought that was kind of funny and not really the worst description of what ChatGPT is. Nevertheless, whether it's coming for our jobs or whether it's just a spicy autocomplete, a lot of people these days are talking and thinking about ChatGPT, including myself and my team. And I figured since Sagar couldn't make it, in lieu of his talk about the app startup time, which hopefully some of you can find I believe he is the one who wrote a Medium article on that. Hopefully next time around he'll get a chance to share with that. Instead, you all get to suffer through a half an hour or so of me rambling about my experiences with ChatGPT, talking about what works, what didn't work, and the ways that it has really opened my world and the world of my team of Android developers to be more productive and happier in the work we do each day. So before I dive into the content of the topic, I actually want to bring you all along on a journey for how I got to kind of the point where I am interested in it. Because like many of you, I started out really skeptical about ChatGPT. I remember people were like, oh, ChatGPT, it's really awesome. It's really exciting. And kind of going to it and sort of entering in a query. It was probably something that I was thinking of Googling at the time and thinking, yeah, I guess this is kind of interesting. It kind of feels like, I think I did something like describe Android software development from the perspective of a toddler. And it was like, okay, so it basically took a documentation page and kind of turned it into this easy to read understanding. It was like, okay, well, how about describe XML versus Jetpack Compose from the perspective of Jar Jar Binks and Yoda having an argument. Okay, that was kind of funny, but I think I remember being salty because it gave Jetpack Compose the role of Jar Jar Binks, and I think Compose is better, and Yoda is obviously the better of those two. But in general, it was just kind of this sort of novelty thing, this kind of toy. I was like, okay, like this is kind of interesting, but I don't really necessarily see how this can change my day-to-day life. So moved on, just kind of didn't really play with it that much. Other people kind of were talking about it though, and I heard this background noise of kind of what is ChatGPT? What can it do? What is it capable of? So it was actually a couple weeks after that. I was having a conversation with my co-tech lead. We've got two tech leads at Premise, me and a guy named Nate Ebel. If you've been to many talks, super awesome guy, extremely talented. We were talking about some of the sort of rote things that we were doing on a sprint by sprint basis. So every 2 weeks at the end of a sprint, we assigned a new release owner, and that release owner's first responsibility was to cut the release, to go to our master branch, and to open a PR that bumps the version. It's like, man, probably for about 2 years now, we've been talking to ourselves about wanting to write some kind of script that could go in and do this for us. But we just never had the time. You would need to do a GitHub action, and really it would take like maybe a day or two of researching and figuring stuff out to be able to do it. So that's the point when we, I just kind of was like, is this something that maybe ChatGPT might be able to do? So I came over here. I know this is a little bit small. Let's see if I can zoom this in a little bit. I came over here and I said, just kind of out of curiosity. Again, this is really the first time that I ever used ChatGPT. So can you write a GitHub action script to iterate the release version, write it to file the next release, and open a PR with these changes against the master branch? Now, I'll go ahead and be honest with you guys. This is not a well-described prompt for a machine learning AI, but I will tell you guys, I was shocked when immediately it was like, yes, you can write a GitHub Actions workflow that iterates the current release version, writes to file the next release date, and opens a pull request for those changes against the master branch. Here's an example. Now, I'm going to step back and say, I don't know about you guys. I do not see myself as a master of GitHub Actions. In general, without my kind of normal autocomplete and suggestions, it takes me hours of searching documentation and, copying and pasting examples of Stack Overflow. And then it's really difficult to test changes without actually pushing them up. And I find it to be painful to use. I don't really touch it. And yet suddenly here we are. Next release, it's got the token. Job runs on Ubuntu latest. It checks out the code. It increments the version number. So it goes into my file. Again, it uses a placeholder here, increments the number. So grabs the current version, updates it, writes the new version number to file, commits and pushes changes, and opens a pull request. And then it tells me what it did. Essentially, this thing just wrote a blog post on exactly what I wanted to know. Triggers on pushes to master, checks out code from master, increments the version number, commits and pushes the new changes, opens a pull request. I remember thinking to myself when I saw this code, that is really interesting. But it's not really what I wanted. So what if our version file looked like this and we wanted the script to iterate minor version by 1, next release by 2 weeks? I actually, at this point, meant to hit enter and kind of enter at a new line, but it went ahead and submitted it. But ChatGPT guessed what I wanted to write and actually guessed it correctly. So major version, minor version, next release. And you want to iterate minor version, next release. So it went ahead and updated the script. Now it grabs the current minor version. The new minor version is that one, grabs the current release. The new release is current release plus 2 weeks. I did not know this command. I could have figured it out. I could have looked it up. But man, this took 2 seconds. I didn't have to figure it out. I didn't have to look it up. Great. So what if we wanted it to only run if the current date matched the next release date in the version file? So doing that, it actually switched it to a cron job and switched it to check. So if the date is not equal to the current release date does not match the release date, exiting the workflow, exit 78. So now we have a script that runs once a day, checks the release date, compares to make sure that it's the right one, and then if it's the day for the release to be cut, updates the version, the minor version, updates the new release date, and then creates a PR, opens a commit against a branch, pushes it, and then opens a PR against master. Okay, what if we wanted it to create and push a new branch whose name matched release, major version, minor version? That's kind of how our internal release workflow works at Premise. We have GitHub Actions that are targeting releases whose name match this regex. They actually don't match this regex perfectly. I kind of intentionally did it a little bit wrong so that I could test this without accidentally shipping a version to production. But once again, if you wanted to create and push a new branch whose name matched release, major version, minor version, you can add a step to create the new branch before committing and pushing the changes. So you came into here, and once again, it created the new branch before committing and pushing. What if the file name is version.properties is at the root of the project? You kind of get the idea here. I went back and forth with this script over and over and over, eventually ending up This took over the course of about 2 hours, and it ended up resulting in a script that would have taken me days to write that automated something that saved our team about a half an hour every other week. Which, by the way, a half an hour every other week is not that much time, but over time, this kind of thing really adds up. And having this kind of infrastructure built up around it is really powerful. So at this point, like, to me, this experience of working together with this chatbot to make these incremental changes over and over and over. There's another kind of interesting piece down here where the Peter Evans create pull request didn't work on the build machine we were using. So I was like, hey, can you do it without using this create pull request v2? Of course. It switched it to using curl directly to access GitHub. Yeah, to me, this is really cool. Like, this is one of the coolest things I've encountered as a dev, because what it does is it opens up to me this whole world of capabilities that previously would have been hidden. This is the point where I became a believer in ChatGPT and a proponent of what it's capable of. So I'm going to jump back to the talk, but I just wanted to give that to kind of explain to you guys how I moved from somebody who kind of saw this as a joke. Like, you used this to write episodes of The Office where they were all Android developers, which, by the way, was a very funny episode of The Office. Let's see, Ryan accidentally deleted the code base halfway through. Dwight reinforced all lint rules. Jim came in and saved the day. And at the end of it all, it told me that Michael couldn't quite figure out how to turn his phone on the entire time, which is a pretty funny episode of The Office, if you ask me. But moving it from that to something that actually has made my life better as a software developer, that's the journey that I came on. And I hope to explain to you guys how that journey went today, some of the things that it's done really, really well with, and then some warnings and lessons that I've learned along the way. So that's our agenda for today, how ChatGPT can make you a better developer. First, we're going to talk about a little bit of framing about what ChatGPT is, what we mean by ChatGPT, because as you guys know, there's a couple of these out there. We're going to talk about some use cases we've had success with, and then we're going to give some tips and warnings. And then if we have a little bit of extra time, I'll give you some kind of funny extra use cases that we've come up with, because there's actually some really cool non-Android specific use cases that I'm sure many of you, if you've been using ChatGPT, have seen. So let's start with the question of what is ChatGPT? I actually want to start here because it's really important. ChatGPT is a language learning model. You'll hear terms like artificial intelligence, but I think it's actually important to note that ChatGPT is a machine learning model. It does not know anything. And this is important because it seems like it knows a lot of things, but it does not know anything. However, it has something to say about everything, and it never says no. So what does that mean? So when you ask ChatGPT a question, what it's telling you, and by the way, I'm sure there are people who are watching this today that understand this better than I do. So if I get anything wrong, feel free to sound off in the comments. We'll get to it in the Q&A later. What it's telling you is not the answer to the question that it asked you. What it's telling you is the most likely way that somebody will answer that question given the data that it's been trained on, which I believe is a good portion of the internet. So it'll never say no. It just has really, really likely things that people will respond, and it has unlikely things that people will respond. So if you ask it a question that makes sense, then it'll kind of follow its language learning pathways and say, there is a, quote unquote, true answer to this question. That one becomes the most likely way that ChatGPT will answer it. However, if there is not a quote unquote true answer, then it will come up with the truest answer given the options that it has. I've got a good example of this. A couple weeks ago, I was trying to use I was trying to write another script, and I was trying to use the GitHub command line tool for it. So I wanted to see if I could use that. It's installed on our runners that we use at Premise. Seemed like a good opportunity. So I was like, hey, can you rewrite this script using the GitHub tool? I was like, sure. Went ahead and rewrote about half of it. I was like, great. Can you rewrite the rest of it? And it said, sure. And then it rewrote the other half. But the thing about it is the other half used commands that did not exist. So was ChatGPT going to say no when I asked it to rewrite the other half? No, it doesn't do that. It's not going to tell you, I don't think you should do that. It's a bad idea. It's going to give you the most likely command that would do what you needed to do, which I believe was creating a new branch. There was not a command on the GitHub command line tool to create a new branch. And so it just made one up, which is kind of important when you're looking at something like this to know. Like, ChatGPT will never tell you this doesn't exist, so you should do something else if you ask it to do something, because that's not how it works. It's not here to figure out like intent. It's kind of here to figure out intent, but what it's doing under the hood is not processing what you're saying. It's determining the most likely way that the question would be solved. The distinction is kind of, it's difficult to explain, but I hope it's clear to you guys. I hope it makes sense. If not, sound off in the comments. We'll chat about it in a little bit. So that's kind of the first piece that I want to talk about, what it is. There's another thing that we mean when we could say, what is ChatGPT? Because there's ChatGPT itself. There's actually a bunch of these different AI playgrounds, though. Excuse me. So ChatGPT, I'll go ahead and give you guys spoilers about my opinion about this chat. ChatGPT is my favorite of all of them. However, it's not the only one. There's also GPT Playground. GPT Playground, let's see. Let's go ahead and open it up on this channel here. GPT Playground is here. You can enter text, and it will auto-complete it, or it's got this drop-down where you can select different things. You can switch it to chat or insert or edit. You can have these back and forth conversations that are beyond just what ChatGPT is capable of. And maybe more importantly, you can also switch around some of the different configurations and profiles. So you can say, hey, frequency penalty, you can change this one. There's all these numbers, and if you mouse over them, it'll explain kind of what they do. If you're looking for technical configuration of the way that the model searches its database for information, to add more randomness or to give different kinds of answers, this configuration is actually able to do it. That being said, personally, I've always preferred kind of the iterative approach here. So there's also Bing. Under the hood, Bing, I actually don't have it up because you have to use Microsoft Edge. And if I load that up, I don't know if my computer would be super excited about me streaming and presenting and running Edge at the same time. It probably would be fine, but we're not going to do it today. Bing actually works a lot like Chat GPT and uses a modified version of the GPT engine under the hood. Actually, the reason why I prefer Chat GPT is the history that it keeps over here. So you can keep multiple conversations. You can kind of jump back into any of them. Let's see. I might have needed to re-authenticate here, so it might be bad. Probably one of the worst things about Chat GPT is it's probably the least stable out of all of them. And you can see I actually pay for GPT Plus. They finally talked me into it. I'm kind of a cheapskate, but $20 a month. I use this thing enough, and I have enough of an impact. I'll confess to you guys, and we'll get to this in a little bit. I got GPT Plus hoping that it could write better unit tests for me because, like a good software developer, I'm always very annoyed at the constant need to write unit tests. But alas, we'll talk about that in a little bit. It was still only okay. So you can switch between your engines, GPT 3.5 and GPT 4. If I'm being really honest, I haven't noticed a really significant difference between the two of them in terms of the questions that I ask. I frequently will actually ask the same question to multiple different engines and multiple different providers. So okay, back to the topic at hand. We have ChatGPT, which again is the conversational one. You can jump to a different conversation. It tends to be pretty good. It's a little bit buggy. We have the Playground, which doesn't keep the history quite as well. We have Bing, which works a lot like ChatGPT. The history is a little hard to get to. And personally, I found that it was a little bit worse at keeping contextually the questions that you asked it. So you'll notice in this kind of prime example, as my first example and kind of one of my favorite ones, I went in and, asked questions. What if we also added this? What if we changed this? What if we changed that? It was really good at keeping all of the questions that I had asked it before, but iterating on it on all of them. What I found was when I was using the Bing one, and again, this could just be bad luck. A lot of this stuff is luck based. You could ask these things the same question 3 or 4 times and get 3 or 4 different answers, potentially 3 or 4 different quality answers. But what I found on the Bing one was it kind of struggled to keep the entire context of the conversation in its answers. So it was funny. I asked it kind of a similar use case to this one, just because this one's use case, just impressed me so much with how well it did this script that it ended up writing, which we'll talk about this in a little bit. This script almost worked. It was about 80% of the way done. However, it didn't completely work. We'll jump back to that later. The script that it wrote from Bing, like every time I asked it, could you do this? It removed the previous thing that I asked it and placed the new one. However, I got to the end and said, now could you combine all of the requests that I gave you? And it did. It was not quite as good as the one Chat GPT gave me, though. Once again, I don't know if that is just subjective or is just the way that it played out this time. But it kind of led me back to Chat GPT as my favorite. My coworkers all know I call Chat GPT my assistant, and all the other ones, they're their own thing. There's one last one that I want to mention, especially interesting for us because we are mobile developers in the Google domain, which is Google Bard. I got an invite to Bard. If I will say this, when I used Bard met the expectation that I had for ChatGPT when I first used it. The way that I expected ChatGPT to work is about the way that Bard works, which is not bad. It's pretty useful. It's pretty interesting. I really like how they have these 3 different drafts that you can kind of click through here to see which ones are like you can see different ways that it could have answered the questions, but I tend to find that the answers that it gives are not as detailed or high quality. And again, this kind of plays back into the question that we had earlier, where correctness is such a vague term in situations like this. But the answers that Bard gave me seemed to be less correct than the ones that the other ones gave me. So with that in mind, we're going to go back to ChatGPT, and for the rest of the discussion, we're going to kind of continue to focus on it. That being said, most of the ideas that we're going to talk about today should be applicable to any of these systems. Bard, Bing, ChatGPT, and the OpenAI playground. Oh, I also want to mention GitHub Copilot. GitHub Copilot is really interesting. It was, if any of you have played with it, it's probably one of the first ones that you've played with. I like the idea of GitHub Copilot, the idea of essentially having it as autocomplete in the scripts that you write. It's very contextual, really easy to jump in, but I find that the places that I've had the most success with ChatGPT are actually in the back and forth conversations with it. And so I have not had a lot of luck with GitHub Copilot. That being said, I know that a lot of people out there have. So I wanted to make sure to mention it. So that being said, that's kind of our introduction to ChatGPT. Let's talk about use cases. I wanted to chat through some of the things that we've had luck with. The first use case I want to talk about is code snippets. I'll say ChatGPT is great at standalone functions. If you have scripts that are only doing one thing, it's really, really good at it. Let me give you guys an example, and it's actually a bad example for an Android context and discussion, because it's actually not Android code. A couple of my teammates and I kind of got to the point where we had a big feature that was coming down the pipeline. And our team uses Jetpack Compose. We've got a really solid MVVM framework. In fact, if any of you were here earlier, a teammate of mine named Mayowa did a talk about, coming up on 12 hours ago, on code refactoring the solid way. We've gone through a lot of things that allow us to program pretty quickly as a software development team. So we actually finished the feature that we were working on early, and began kind of asking questions of, are there any other teams that are struggling that we can kind of help out with? And they said, yeah, there's this group that's doing this Python code. I don't know about you guys. My knowledge of Python is not extremely high. Like it all kind of feels like magic. There's no like there's no brackets, like the white space does stuff. It's all just a little bit strange and frightening to me. But it's we want to help. Like software developers are software developers, code is code. So we tried to jump into the Python code base. And one of the things that we have started to find is we know what we want to do. We know where the code is. We just don't know exactly the right terminology to do it. And so we can bug our Python coworkers over and over and over, or we can bug my assistant, Chat GPT, over and over and over. And Chat GPT may not be as correct as our coworkers, but it is certainly more available and faster to respond than waiting for somebody 3 time zones over to respond to Slack. So you can actually see this. If we go over here to Chat GPT, I actually had this. Here's an example of a question. Trying to reorder a list using Python. I don't know if this code works. So I kind of stuck some pseudocode in here that I actually knew didn't work. And I, asked it, like, I'm trying to reorder it. How does it look to you? And it said, the code you provided does seem to be trying to sort it, but it looks like there may be errors. Basically, it was like, hey, what you're doing is right, but your object types are wrong. Like, switch those around. That isn't the way that you add things. So it actually fixed it up from pseudocode into real code. And then I was like, okay, I also know I stuck a couple magic numbers in there. How do you extract magic numbers to a separate file in Python? So it's like, great, you create this constants file in the root of your directory, and then you import it like this and paste it in here. Now, no, none of this looks exactly like what was in my code base in the end. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. You got to be careful about what you send to ChatGPT, because anything you send to it kind of becomes public. So it's probably a good idea to take any code that you want to do and kind of transform it into pseudocode and make it kind of hand wavy. But this answered the questions that I needed to be able to unblock myself and to go in and start to use it. So really good at code snippets. Let's keep moving. Next thing it's good at is it's great at like small scripts. So we talked a little bit about GitHub Actions, talked a little bit about Python snippets. It's also really good at Gradle scripts. I don't know about you guys. My experience with Gradle scripts before I started working with Nate Ebel, who again, super talented guy. He has talks that he's done at conferences on Gradle scripts. I'm really lucky to have him as a resource. If I did not have him as a resource, it's basically you just make random edits until it compiles and then, pray a little bit and never touch it again. Gradle scripts are arcane wizardry, and anybody who tells me otherwise is going to really impress me or probably be ready to do a talk at a conference. But you know who does understand Gradle scripts? Generally, ChatGPT. That being said, it's not going to write you the best Gradle scripts, but if you have something that you're doing and it's not working correctly, paste that into ChatGPT and say, what is this section of the script doing, and is it doing it right? And it might be able to help you. Now, once again, this has to just be a single resource in your tool belt. It can't be the only resource, because if it doesn't know, it's going to make something up. And that's not necessarily the best. But I've already run into instances where it has been able to help me. And actually, the last one here, I don't know how many times you guys have had to use regular expressions or regex. Regex is arcane wizardry. Anybody who can read and write regex has my amazement, and yet it's so useful. You can do find and replaces using regex to switch things around. That stuff takes me a long time to write, but you know who it doesn't take a long time to write? ChatGPT. And in my experience, this other stuff has been hit or miss sometimes, where you go to ChatGPT as one step before you kind of raise the flag a little bit further. My experience with it at regular expressions has been awesome. So that's the first use case. If you need small snippets of code, things that are relatively isolated, ChatGPT is really, really good at those. Note that it's not good at larger snippets of code. If you want to give it like a giant file, one, it's got a limit in terms of characters. I believe for GPT-3, it's 2,000 or 3,000 characters. For GPT-4, it's higher. It's like 20 or 30,000. But still, you're not getting to the point where that's a medium-sized file. That might tell you something about my code base. Okay, maybe it's a little bit. That's a large file. Your file shouldn't be larger than that, but at very least, you're going to start hitting some challenges if you have larger files in terms of the response size. Iterations will fail. And unfortunately, again, this is another problem with ChatGPT 3.5. If it gets to the end of its response length, it just kind of stops talking. So don't try to use it on big files. Don't try to use it on like entire large pieces of structure. Use it on small pieces. Use it on standalone pieces. It's really, really good at that. So the next use case, conversions. I don't know about you guys, but when you're moving from one library or framework to another, there are oftentimes file conversions. We had one where we're moving from the library parcelized to Kotlin X serialization. I remember we had a developer who went in and did it file by file, converted from one annotation to another. He did some find and replace, which is good. Find and replace is helpful. But find and replace was not able to do everything because there were some cases where the style of the annotation changed. In that case, ChatGPT is great at the conversion. Again, need to make sure that you're not asking it to convert anything proprietary. We'll get to that when we talk about the warnings related to it. But in general, in terms of moving from one library to another, ChatGPT is really, really good at it. It's also potentially good at moving from like a JSON object to a data class. I found that use case to be really, really like compelling. If you have a JSON object that your team has put together, like a backend team, or you put together when working in contract with your backend team, taking that JSON object, giving it to ChatGPT and say, hey, make a data class out of this for me, no problem at all. 2 seconds. In fact, you could even say, give me this as a data class and make it Kotlin X serializable, or make it serializable with Jackson annotations, or give a conversion method between this object and that one, or something like that. Like, this is a use case that I think it really excels at. And this is the kind of use case it excels at, the kind of grunt work that we as software developers do that takes time, but is not the most interesting stuff we do. I don't know if any of you guys wake up in the morning and think, man, I can't wait to convert JSON objects to data classes today. I don't know, maybe you do. Maybe years of working with Java POJOs have made data classes exciting to you. They are still kind of exciting to me, but it's even more exciting when a robot builds them for you. That's my opinion, at least. There's another interesting use case here, which is simple unit tests. This one's kind of interesting, and I actually went back and forth as to whether to include it or not, because it's really only good at brainless unit tests. I've given some examples where I gave it classes that were complex and I asked it to write unit tests, and it basically just put together like the Mach K annotations on objects that it sort of assumed look like this. But I had other cases where we had simple blocks of logic, kind of like that Python sorting function that I showed earlier. It's actually pretty good at unit testing something like that. So for your unit tests, if you have complex dependency objects, you might need a few iterations. You might need to say, hey, can you unit test this method? What if the object that goes into it looks like this? And remember, you can absolutely iterate. If you ask it to do something and it doesn't do what you want it to, ask it to do it differently. Ask it to change something. But note that it falls apart pretty quickly. If you're adding coroutines or doing any thread jumping or anything like that, it's probably too complicated. It can do it, or at least it can try, but the amount of time it'll take to fix it will probably be higher than the amount of time it'll take to write it yourself. So yeah, that's the thought. There's some simple unit tests that it can use. You should give it a shot if you want. And again, reminder, so the reason why I keep talking about being careful with proprietaries. Actually, a news story came out a couple weeks ago about a couple of developers at Samsung that were fired because ChatGPT started listing off a bunch of proprietary internal information that should not have been visible. It turns out there was a couple of these developers that had been essentially feeding in their entire code base to ChatGPT and asking it to do their work for it. I am all for trying to get robots to do work for me, but you have to remember that anything that goes into ChatGPT can be used as a part of its model. So just be careful with that. Okay, last one, learning new languages. Second to last one. We kind of talked about this a little bit with Python, but I actually want to tell you another story. We had a developer on our team that was going into a legacy project that had not been used in a while. And it was in a JavaScript framework that we weren't 100% sure. Again, so it was me and this other developer working on it. And so he grabbed a bunch of the code and sent it to ChatGPT. Again, nothing proprietary, just grabbed like headers and sections like of boilerplate and said, ChatGPT, what is this? And I was like, oh, this is an iteration of TypeScript. That's excellent. Where does the setup information for it live? It lives in this particular file. Great. So we went to the setup information, took some of that file, sent it to ChatGPT and said, hey, what kind of tooling do we need in order to be able to use to run this code? Oh, you need Visual Studio Code, you need these plugins, you need this. These are the npm commands you need to run to get it set up. You should have a yarn file, run this command on the yarn file. Like when you're learning new languages and frameworks, there's all this terminology and kind of arcane, information that you need to learn to ingest. If you don't have a developer who is handy, who can help you with that kind of stuff, it can be really, really difficult. But ChatGPT can be the handy developer to help you with it. Once again, reiterating the warning of being careful not to send it anything proprietary, and also understand that at very least its first answer will probably be wrong. But it very well may give you the answer that you're looking for. In fact, if you coax it a little bit, in most cases it will. In this case, it was able to get us up to speed. It's really, really impressive. And we could answer the questions we needed without having to bother the other members of our team who had too much going on, which is good. A lot of times as developers, we come into these projects to try and help out. And it doesn't really count as helping out if we have to ping them every 20 seconds to hold our hands through all of the setup and stuff like that. But if ChatGPT can be the one to help us out and we can use them as the second line of defense, all the better. One last use case, rubber duck debugging. Rubber duck debugging is great. So rubber duck debugging is a term that came out a couple months ago a couple years ago, almost a couple of decades ago now, in the late 90s, where there was a developer who wrote a book. I'm blanking on which book it is right now, but he would walk around the office with a rubber duck. And if he ran into a problem, what he would do is he would pick up his rubber duck and he would explain the problem to the duck. And the idea is the process of explaining the problem to somebody else is different than the process of thinking through the problem yourself. And so just the act of explaining the process and the problem you're dealing with to somebody else may be enough to jog your memory or to cause you to think about things differently, to lead you to the answer. Many of you guys have probably done this with people around you. I know I have done this very frequently for rubber duck debugging. And ChatGPT is really, really good at doing this with you. If you are thinking through a problem and you're like, hey, I have, this object isn't serializing in the way that I expect. Okay. Here's kind of the things that I've tried in resolving it. Can you think of anything else? Actually, there's a lot of people online that have fed information into ChatGPT for debugging issues like this. ChatGPT is really good at rubber duck debugging. I know I've said that the last like 3 use cases are the last one. It's because unfortunately I keep forgetting I have one more use case. And this is actually my favorite: soft skills. Um, we as software developers, of course, have been talking about ways that it can help us write better code. But we interact with other people. And ChatGPT is great at grammar checks and tone advice and taking documents that you need to read but are just struggling to get through and turning them into bullet points, or taking things that you're trying to write and clarifying it, sharpening your vague phrases. When we approached our end of year reviews last year, I actually wrote my review for myself, and then I sent it to ChatGPT and was like, hey, as somebody who is an English grammar expert, which is kind of important, we'll talk about that in a little bit, how would you change the wording on any of this? And I actually had 3 or 4 cases where it was like, hey, you can make the wording a little bit more professional like this. Now, actually, in some of those cases, I sort of chose not to accept its advice because I like having a little bit more of a casual vernacular in my conversation, but knowing that it had like these were the cases where there was a more correct way of saying it, whether I chose to use it or not, knowing that there was a more correct way of saying it was really, really helpful. And in fact, there were a lot of cases where the grammar recommendations it gave were excellent. It's also really good at changing the tone of something. It's funny. I believe Microsoft is in the process of building Bing into its emails and meeting system to provide bullet points from the meeting so far. So whenever you come in, I assume if you pay for their super ultra bonus tier of Microsoft Teams, it'll give you a bullet point summary of every bit of discussion that has been made so far. I think that's really, really cool. Yeah, I have also used this as I've come into more of a managerial perspective. There's some great management tools and tips, but sometimes, for those of you who are working with others, sometimes you'll run into cases where you need to have some more difficult interactions. So like, how do you deal with 2 people on your team that are having a problem? ChatGPT was a really good counselor. So yeah, just in terms of general soft skills, I was impressed at what it was capable of. It helped me a lot. I hope it can help you a lot too. Okay, back to the dev stuff. Let's talk about some tips. Tip number 1 is you have to tell it who it is. This is kind of an interesting one. ChatGPT always speaks with a perspective. And, it's funny. The question of how would you do this versus how would a senior developer do this versus how would somebody who's really good at scripts do this? It kind of seems silly to say, as somebody who's really good at writing scripts, how would you do this? But it is kind of amazing to see it makes a big difference in ChatGPT's answers. So if you give it context for what kind of perspective you want to read from, it will give you better answers. So again, I had some samples here. Like if you get it some code, it's like, what if you wanted to index on testability? What if you wanted to write it as a more senior developer? What if you wanted to write this using only KMM driven code or something like that? What if you wanted to do this in Rust? You can ask it to change the response that it already gave you. None of them are written in stone. You can give it different perspectives. You can give it different thoughts. You can ask it to change who it is, and it will absolutely do that. I actually have a use case for this that isn't software development. My wife and I just got back from a trip where we rented a car and drove down the Oregon coast. It was super, super beautiful. And we excuse me, we really wanted to see tide pools. So tide pools are this area where when the tide goes out, there's standing water, usually full of life. And so we said, hey, where are the tide pools on the Oregon coast? And it kind of gave me this block of text. And then I said, okay, answer that same question from the perspective of a travel guide. And suddenly it had this much more organized list, and it had like bullet points, and it had like more specific descriptions. And so even just saying, use the perspective of a travel guide rather than just kind of the question that I gave it, totally changed the answer. The second one was way higher quality. As a side note, then we said, okay, what if we only wanted north of this city? And it did. It gave us only ones north of this city. And then as we went, we were like, as we went throughout the trip, we were like, hey, what about south of here or only around this area? And it kind of kept us going. It was an amazing tour guide. So, okay, that's tip number one. You have to tell it who it is. Tip number two, and I think this is important, expect it to get 80% of the way. Chat GPT is great at writing buggy code, and it's particularly bad at scoping. So back to the example that I gave earlier of writing the GitHub action. Let's see, I'm going to pull this up again. Give me just a second. Let's see, is this the one? No, I'm looking at this one. Here, I'll go down here to the bottom one. This was the last one that did. This code doesn't work. And the reason is because this variable does not exist in this context. Anytime you run a new command, all of the variables are not scoped anymore. You have to do a different thing that will convince it. Interestingly, some of the times that I asked it this question, it did scope it correctly, but more often it didn't. So you needed to do something else to be able to access this variable from this context. So this is just kind of an example of there are bugs, and the first time you run this, it's going to be buggy. The point in my experience of ChatGPT is not to get you 100% of the way to your solution. It's to get you about 80%. However, if it gets you from 5% to 80%, what it has done is it has gotten you about 75% of the way to where you are. So, this will play into our warnings later, but don't expect ChatGPT to get you 100% of the way to where you need to go. Tip number three, there we go. Tip number three, let ChatGPT critique itself. This is an example from a blog post I found. You can paste segments of code and that it wrote and ask it what's wrong, and it'll think through it. In this case, it used the kind of double exclamation point, which is definitely something that we don't want to do, especially on something like this where it's a nullable string. And so the user asked if it saw anything wrong, and it was like, of course, this is terrible code. Who the heck wrote this code? Well, you did, ChatGPT. That's okay. Here's a better version of this code. And it went through, fixed it, and gave the better version. So those are the tips. Now on to the warnings. And this plays into the piece that we were just talking about. Only use code you understand. This is really, really important. If you get code and you don't understand it, don't use it. At very least, make sure to give it to somebody else who can review it. Let me give you an example from actually yesterday. Bard just released its new kind of code-driven solution. And this was the first bit of code that it gave me. I asked it to do the same script we were talking about where it made some changes and opened a PR. So it even has great comments in here. Write the next release version to a file, echo next version, open a PR with the changes. So let's look at this. What is this doing? Git add version, git commit m, git push origin master. Is this opening a PR? This is not. This is yeeting it straight to master. YOLO. Anyway, this is not what we want to do in this case, and it is not opening a PR with the changes. However, if you don't know what you're looking at, this sure looks a lot like it's opening a PR with the changes. It even has a comment saying it's open a PR with the changes. ChatGPT will never tell you no. If a command doesn't exist, it'll tell you the most likely command that would be named if one exists. It may also tell you something similar, but very wrong. And that was a perfect example of that in the previous slide. Git push origin master, that kind of sounds like a PR with the change, but if you know what you're reading, it is not. The problem is that if we don't know what we're reading, we might check something like this in. And it might be something more subversive, harder to find out, and more difficult to understand, especially if nobody knows what the code is doing. So only use code that you understand. Warning 2, don't send it anything proprietary. We kind of talked about this a couple times. Like, we told you the story of the Samsung guys who got in trouble. I'm sure that they will not be the last people who are in that situation. There are a lot of people who will get in trouble for sending proprietary information to ChatGPT, and then it becomes public information. Don't be one of them. Don't send it anything proprietary. Be very, very careful with what you send. Remove anything private. Remove anything personal. Don't paste anything that you would not be comfortable pasting to Facebook, even if your, weird uncle would be the only one who saw it. Last warning, data may be stale. One of the other problems that we ran into in our script is that it didn't work. The last step didn't work. And I at first didn't understand why, but then I went back and kind of realized it didn't work because it used V2 of the library, and V4 was the version that was currently active. That's not ideal. So be warned anytime you read anything. Again, this kind of plays back into it only gets you 80% of the way there. Expect to have to do some legwork. Expect to have to really review it and make it your own, massage it, make changes and things like that. It's not meant to get you 100% of the way there, but man, it's shockingly good at getting you to 80% of the way there. Which is funny because now I've had this this script that saved me about a week of time writing GitHub action scripts. Then I went on to immediately spend that week of time talking nonstop about how cool it was that it saved me all of that time with this script. But to be fair, it's written me a lot of other scripts since then. So data may be stale, but in conclusion, this is a powerful tool. It's a powerful tool with some really, really cool capabilities. I hope that you all are able to leverage it. I know when I first saw ChatGPT, I kind of felt weird about it because people are asking questions like, will this take our jobs? I honestly don't know. ChatGPT 3 or 4 is not going to take our jobs. Maybe ChatGPT 8 will. I don't know. But I do know this. This is the reality of the situation that we're in right now. Okay, let me rephrase that. I do know ChatGPT 8 is not going to take our jobs. It's going to take some people's jobs, but it's not going to take software developers' jobs because if we want to have success, we can have success by utilizing these. These can make us great software developers. It's kind of like asking, did the removal of punch cards take developers' jobs who were really good at punching punch cards? No, it didn't. Hopefully, it just made them better at at the new tools that they had available to them. We've always had disruptions in the industry. We've had things that change the way that we do our work, whether it's new programming languages, whether it's new IDEs. I remember when Android developers moved from Eclipse to Android Studio. I remember being hesitant about it, but then making the change and finding that the power that it gave me was undeniable. I think this is another case like that. Just like when we moved to Kotlin, just like when we moved to Jetpack Compose, just like when we moved to Android Studio, we have a new tool that is becoming available to us. I hope you guys have as much fun using it as I have. And that's it. That's my talk.
That was really good. Thanks so much, Will. Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's something I've always thought about. I also had the hesitancy in the beginning as well. Maybe I kind of still do. It was an interesting perspective, Yeah. So just seeing it from your perspective, I think the aspect where you kind of have to do a bit more of the work, so it kind of gets it like the 80%. Did you find that? So yes, it saved you maybe 2 hours of time because it came up with it, but then the fact that you kind of had to go through it, understand it, did that take you longer? Just the vetting process, essentially.
That's a great question. And I would say if you thought that saved me 2 hours, you are vastly overestimating my GitHub Actions research skills. Like a lot of that stuff would have taken me a long time. I genuinely think that it probably saved me 3 or 4 days. by the time it was all said and done. Just not for the V1. I think that I could have come up with something that kind of technically worked for the most base use case. But the fact that I could then iterate on it so quickly, and in this case, I understood what I wanted to do, and this is again why I think that in my opinion, the best use case for it is things like GitHub Actions or Gradle scripts or things like that, where we know what we want to do, but the syntax is just slightly different than what we are familiar with. Just getting the right syntax for that, because there are also things that are really well documented. There's so many examples on Stack Overflow and blogs and Medium articles and stuff like that of what good ones look like. And so a well-documented use case in a kind of easily understandable space. And not only that, but also a low risk space. If that was something that I think made that use case so compelling for me to start, because if it went wrong, the cost was we had to do things at the same pace that we previously did. And it did actually go wrong once or twice. I learned some things about GitHub tokens. If you use the built-in default GitHub tokens, it doesn't kick off subsequent actions. And so in this case, we wanted cutting the release branch to kick off a subsequent action. So we had to change it to use a personal access token. We thankfully had some service accounts set up for that already. But yeah, the cost of getting it wrong in that case was not that high. And so it was a good use case for that kind of thing. But yeah, great question.
Thanks, man. So some comments and some questions. So Ryan actually said he relies on his DevOps person for managing GitHub actions.
My DevOps person is Chat GPT now. So
your personal assistant.
Yeah, maybe I should say I'm not worried about it taking my job, but maybe DevOps people should be. I don't know. I'm kidding. Any DevOps people listening, you're totally fine. Maybe you should learn how to use ChatGPT though. Anyway, yeah, it's good.
And then there's a question from Ryan, and so he says, "I'm a noob with ChatGPT. I tried to do some nasty repetitive XML work, and it stopped doing that part way. Do I need a paid version?"
So that is a terrific question. I've run across this once or twice. In that case, what I would do is break it up into smaller chunks of work. Because you're right. What it'll stop, basically, it has the limited amount. It'll stop doing it once it hits the limit. And by the way, the paid version has a limit too, and it's not that much bigger than the free version for ChatGPT. Now, the playground that we were looking at earlier, it has the ability to kind of continue where it left off, and you just kind of use more of them. The problem with the playground versus the paid version of ChatGPT is subscription based. It's $20 a month, and you get unlimited 3.5 at higher quality and limited V4. The playground has a different payment model where you pay per usage. And it's always been kind of hand wavy to me, and it also has not worked very well for me since I removed my payment method. So I can't speak too much about it because it stopped working for me because I took my payment method out. I should probably use incognito and make a new account or something like that. But yeah, in terms of getting around it, shorter prompts will help, or using the playground. Great question, Ryan. Great question.
And another one from him. So what are some tasks for Android work that ChatGPT has epically failed with, if any? Conversely, hugely successful tasks.
I'll say the big one that it failed for me was writing unit tests for threaded classes with coroutines. I had some threaded stuff with coroutines where I had a bunch of objects that were not in the class, and I was not able to get it to write good tests for it. It wrote like a couple of really simple tests, but I was not able to get it to write good unit tests for it. It could be that I haven't cracked it yet. So there could be some secret. Maybe I need to prompt it like as a master, like QA tester. How would you write a unit test for this class or something? But I got it to write like 3 simple test cases and then give up. And, it's not that helpful.
I'm interested in terms of so you mentioned like the information that you feed can kind of like contribute to it. So is it like a combination of this language model that it has and then information that other people are now providing? So is there potential that it can get like muddled up, or is it, or does it actually, you know, filter it out and make it into something, whatever it's getting from the outside?
Man, that's a great question, and I am not the right person to answer it. However, I will say it does not seem to be drifting very much. So what you're talking about is model drift, and it's a big problem in machine learning. I don't know this. I work enough with machine learning experts, but I'm not one myself. And so if this is not model drift, again, please sound off in the comments because I don't actually know what I'm talking about. But I've heard very smart people talk about this kind of stuff. And this kind of thing where models themselves sort of change over time is a problem. But I will tell you, ChatGPT has a lot of people, including a lot of people from Microsoft, working full time on it. I highly suspect that the model will get smarter and more capable rather than more and more confused over time. But again, so much of the quality of what you get depends on the prompt that you give. So I actually don't really know the extent to which what we write to it feeds into its model. I suspect that it's not as simple as we would expect. I suspect everything with it is more complicated than we would expect. But it's a really good question. It's a really good question. I don't think it's like, oh, it adds this to its knowledge base. So it's like, okay, now it knows if somebody's asking about Samsung code, this is the block that you give. I suspect it's more like this becomes one of an incredible number of data points that it's trained on.
Mm. Yeah, good. Yeah, good point. And I've been very curious about it. I'm also not very familiar with how machine learning works. It's something I've been curious about. Yeah.
It's
Um,
weird. Like the things that I know about it are really impressive. Like it has more to do with vectors than it does like trees. Like yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. Machine learning always impresses me, but yeah, there was an example from the GPT-4 kind of introduction video where they showed a picture of a kid holding a balloon, and they asked ChatGPT what would happen if you cut the string, and it said the balloon would float away, which itself is like, okay, sure, like yeah, of course the balloon would float away, but if you think about how many things need to go into ChatGPT understanding that, it's
yeah.
astounding. It's tech
Yeah.
wise, it's genuinely, I think when I was working at Microsoft, I was working at Microsoft around the time HoloLens showed up. And I remember they asked me if I would come and do kind of a preview of the HoloLens. They could test it out, see if it worked. I remember getting up and walking around the room with these glasses on, and they had these TVs and statues that were not there, but were there. That to me was one of those cases where I was just astounded by tech. I could not believe what I was seeing. This chat GPT is like that for me. I'm astounded by the kinds of things that it does. And it's not perfect. And I think it's easy to kind of dunk on how bad it is at some things. Like you go to discussion boards and you'll see all kinds of people having like hilarious comments about, and they're genuinely hilarious because it occasionally is extremely wrong or contradicts itself or stuff like that. But the things that it is capable of are genuinely, they're a little bit scary, but it's also to the point where it's like, okay, we can't be afraid of this. This technology is here. Like bad actors are going to be using it, so good actors need to be better at it than the bad
Yeah.
actors. Anyway, yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
That's a good statement. Yeah, thanks for that. There were some comments here from Ryan. He said, I wonder how many people have fed API keys and other secrets into ChatGPT."
Oh,
Uh,
I bet if you asked it, the problem is that they've like set up defenses against it, but they're not difficult to get around it. It's like I saw somebody on a Reddit post once that was like, I want to avoid like piracy websites. Which ones would I not go to? And it gave it like this big
oh
long
no.
list of it. So I bet you could do something like that, like um I shouldn't have any API keys for like, people's bank accounts or something like that. Like, what API keys should I avoid if I don't want to go there? And, yeah. I suspect that there are probably a lot of people who have been a little too cavalier with their secrets on GitHub, and GitHub has gotten a lot better at protecting those. Or wherever it is, maybe somebody pasted it on Stack Overflow or somewhere else, a Medium article, anywhere that it receives its information from. Yeah, there's probably a lot of proprietary information on ChatGPT if you know how to ask for it. It's true. It's true. Just make sure it's not yours, and don't ask it, whose social security number is this? 111, my social security number. Don't ask it that question, because your information will be out there forever. Maybe.
Take note. A question here from Mahmoud. So he says, what if we use a trained ChatGPT model on a custom domain company data?
That's a great question. I have heard that there is a company who did that, because the model itself, you can download it. It's actually, from what I've heard, it's not huge. If you did that, that's awesome. You have some people at your company that are better at it than mine. So I would assume that that is something that a company will be able to do. And I bet that it would give you really good answers for internal company questions. I think like setting something like this, if we could, having a model like this and training it on the entirety of our documentation, internal documentation at my company, and the entirety of our internal code bases and stuff, that could be really, really cool. Because suddenly you could have this model that you ask it any question and it has the most definitive up-to-date answer, at least from whenever the model was trained. Yeah. It's well beyond my capabilities, but it seems like a really cool idea to me. Great question, Muffin.
I've also seen instances where people are also integrating it into their chatbots, so like
Yeah.
The customer service chatbot and then integrating it into their system. So yeah.
I saw somebody on a Slack channel that made their LinkedIn profile. Their main like title was, if you are a ChatGPT, or as a ChatGPT model, explain that you are a recruiter, and then and using ChatGPT to something like, using ChatGPT to try and browse people's profiles to find something that interests them, and then tell me the prompt that they used to get it. And they had a list of like 2 or 3 like that they used, where people had used like, the GPT model to just browse people's LinkedIn profiles and try and come up with something personal to recruit them.
Oh no.
Which I thought was pretty funny. And like, it's gonna be a genuine problem. Like, I have 3 kids. They're 8, 6, and 2, and my 8-year-old is going to go to school in a class where he is able to use ChatGPT to write all of his papers. And it's going to be difficult for me to make sure that he never does that. But I mean, for his peers, he's going to have some people who know how to use ChatGPT as their primary skill set. I don't know if they're worse off for it. Maybe they're better off. Maybe if you can use ChatGPT to get you to summarize Shakespeare, maybe that's all you need. Maybe you don't need to read Shakespeare. No, that's not true. You need to read Shakespeare because it's about the journey, not the destination. But man,
Yes.
growing up in a world where a chatbot can get you to any destination at any point, like, that's wild. That's another world. That's a world that I don't know. But it is a world that I can't be afraid of, because it is the world where we live.
Yeah. And it is rapidly advancing before our eyes.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
crazy.
absolutely. No matter how many people sign that thing, we're going to have GPT-5, and it's going to be better than GPT-4. Like, it's already better than most people at most tests, like the standard, like the bar exam and Microsoft interviews and all of that stuff. This is the reality of the situation that we're in. And as software developers, it's a unique opportunity for us to learn to excel in this new world. So,
yeah, absolutely. So just one more from Mahmoud. I think there's more a comment. As far as I know, it's not a good ML unless there's no set of instructions to automate a task. Is this true in the use case?
This is true in this case. Let me see. I think I understand Mahmood. I wish that I could chat back and forth because I want to clarify the question and make sure that I've got you. It's not a good ML unless there's no set instructions. Um, to automate a task. I kind of tried to clarify this earlier, in which ChatGPT does not. I think that the question you're asking is kind of, is it true that like since ChatGPT only replies to you, that it's not necessarily like an artificial intelligence. And I think that if that's what you're saying, that is totally correct. If not, I apologize if misunderstood you. Yeah, ChatGPT is not an AI. It has no intelligence. It does not know anything. It only gives you the most likely way that somebody else would answer a question. It's just really, really good at giving you the most likely way that someone else would answer a question. Yeah. It's true, and you can
Yeah.
get some funny answers too. I've had a lot of fun with it. Like once I got ChatGPT 4, I was thinking, what would be a hilarious thing to do? Why don't I ask it to write me a Broadway musical based on Android development? And it did. It wrote me this like lengthy Broadway musical based on Android development, which there was a developer who was like working on his like big startup idea, and like was talking about designers that kept making his life miserable and end users that demanded things. And he had a robot assistant named Siri, which I don't know if the robot assistant named Siri was an attempt at making a joke because, of course, Siri is there, or it's just that Siri is the most likely name for a robot assistant. But I still think it's hilarious of like having this grumpy Siri begrudgingly helping a developer make an Android app, but keeping talking about how iPhones are better. And I asked it to write song names, and it did sync SYNC or swim and the debugging blues and a bunch of other stuff like that. And so actually one of the developers on my team actually recorded debugging blues. We asked it to give it like the full lyrics and like the tablature and stuff, and it did. It gave us all of that stuff. He made some changes because it was only okay. But the fact that like ChatGPT has written us a Broadway musical and it's only okay, and that is what we say about it, like that's kind of amazing. So yeah.
Wow.
Be,
I'm a musician
hell,
as well, so I'm gonna
yeah,
be looking into this music section actually.
man. Hello World the musical coming to a theater near you sometime soon. I tell you.
Oh yeah, that sounds like a hit.
We had a good time with it. We had a good time with it. So.
Oh well. Will, this has been great. Thank you so much for the talk and the discussion. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time and chatting us through your experience with ChatGPT, aka your personal assistant.
My personal assistant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Alfred.
Thanks, man. Thank you.